Well, when the United States and Israel started this war, there was no imminent threat from Iran. That brought the question of legality into question. The US president then vowed to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age, deliberately targeting and destroying civilian infrastructure, something that would run contrary to international law. The reaction from world leaders limited. So is the use of force becoming national policy, and where will this lead our world and leave the idea of international law? Well, to bring us his insight, we can speak now to Professor of Law at Cambridge University and Director of the Global Governance and Security Centre at Chatham House, Professor Marc Weller. Thanks so much for your time and joining us on France 24. We currently have this 2-week ceasefire being announced, but the threat is still there. And even when we look at what has happened so far, what's been carried out by the United States and Israel in Iran so far, have they broken international law?
Oh, yes. The use of force by the United States was never justified in this instance. It is an unlawful aggressive war, and the threat to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age, to wipe out its civilization, is, of course, in addition, a massive violation or threat of violation of humanitarian law. In war, it is never permitted to target civilian installations, even if there is some sort of military benefit to be derived from doing so. That benefit must not be out of proportion to the damage done to civilians and civilian infrastructure. Here, the aim would have been very precisely to target civilian infrastructure just for that very purpose, for punishing Iran, for punitive measures, and that is never permitted in war.
No, we already saw, Israel struck the gas field, providing power to the vast majority of Iranians, saying it takes money away from the regime, but it also was striking, something that people relied on to live. So if that all goes against the rules of international law, I mean, are the US and Israel signed up to the rules of international law?
Well, that is a risk that the US conduct and also Israel's conduct since the Gaza conflict, which also raised important and profound questions, will contribute to a sense that international law doesn't matter. But in reality, the situation is somewhat different. The European states, and especially the African and Asian states, are uniting around the idea that whatever the US policy may be at this time, whatever the offenses Russia is committing in relation to Ukraine as well, that the rest of the world wants to preserve an international rule of law. And this is a development that is only now starting. There is an international coalition forming, trying to say, well, you seem to be locked out of our system of global governance for now, but we will not be intimidated, and we will continue to pursue international relations according to the rule of law. It is Europe that suffered the consequences of this very dramatic conflict of World War II that destroyed the entire continent. The Americans have not suffered really the consequences of war to that extent, and perhaps don't appreciate what a huge achievement for humanity it was to agree that war can never be a means of national policy. And it is really up to us, the other states, and France has taken a useful position in that respect, to insist that this achievement should not be loosely jeopardized.
When we look, though, I mean, if I understand correctly, Israel and the US, they're not under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. We saw international law, laid out during the Hague Conventions or the Geneva Conventions 1949. But again, Israel, the US didn't sign up to protocols that came later in the 1970s. I mean, how can the consequences of breaking these international laws be imposed?
The US and Israel are party to the Geneva Conventions, although, as you say, not the additional protocols, but the essential principles, including the principle that you must never target civilians as the principal object of the armed conflict, which is what Mr. Trump had threatened, is, of course, binding on all states, including the US. But you're right to say that the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over the US and Israel, who have not become party to its statute. On the other hand, senior officials involved in this policy, had it gone ahead, would have been liable to criminal prosecution in any individual state they might have been visiting afterwards. I remember a meeting with the late Mr. Kissinger, where he spoke for hours about his trouble traveling around the world because he always had to check whether any state he was visiting might prosecute him for alleged war crimes concerning the Vietnam War. So there is some risk for the individuals involved if individual states are willing to exercise jurisdiction in relation to alleged crimes.
Okay, so what we need is other states to react. And I have to say the reaction to what we've seen, notably from the United States when it uses force, we've seen it move into Venezuela, we've seen it threaten Greenland, we're now looking at Iran. I mean, it seems like quite a limited reaction, a limited condemnation from other states. I mean, what consequences do you think this has?
You're absolutely right. The international system defends itself and retains its rules by other states identifying a violation as being a violation and objecting to it. President Trump has had a free ride initially because states were unwilling, or at least Western states were unwilling, to risk their relations with the US by condemning action. This changed when he was demanding the surrender of Greenland. Europe suddenly stood up united and opposed the threat of the use of force. Now, gradually, after the clearly unlawful armed action against Iran, more and more states have actually started to speak out and to identify this as clearly an unlawful use of force. So states, I think, are gradually noticing that it is more important to preserve the international system, to preserve all of our sense of security, that we are not faced with the constant prospect of war, that this is more important than appeasing the temporary US president, however powerful he may think he is at present.
And when we look back to maybe the national situation in the United States, I mean, there is growing opposition to Trump's actions. I mean, how likely is it that he'll be, he'll face consequences there?
That may be likely only once the government changes. For instance, if the Democrats gain the majority in Congress in November, or there is a new administration in 2 to 3 years after further elections, there is no backing for this war, and it is a war, from Congress. There has been no decision under the War Powers Resolution, and the more extreme actions of the US president may also be pursued in the US, although this is perhaps only a limited likelihood. Some have even argued that there could be a case of impeachment for the US president, but again, he has survived these challenges before.
Before we let you go, Professor, I mean, one wonders as well about servicemen when it comes to these types of war. You know, they're under the direct command of the Commander-in-Chief, President Donald Trump, and yet they're being asked to go and commit what, by most experts' opinions is war crimes. Do they have an out? How does it work when you're in the army?
Well, it is a very difficult situation. You will have noticed that the International Criminal Court has indicted the Russian Minister of Defense and several of his high officials for precisely these kind of crimes, for attacking energy facilities and the civilian infrastructure necessary for the survival of the civilian population. In this case, there has been the suggestion in the US that US service members involved in indiscriminate attacks against civilians should refuse to obey, but of course they would then face severe penalties under the US criminal legal system or military disciplinary system. In reality, it will be mainly the commanders that will face responsibility for ordering these kind of actions. But individuals too, if they realize that they are violating humanitarian law, committing grave breaches of the Geneva law, should actually refuse to carry out these orders.
Professor Marc Weller, thanks so much for bringing us your expertise and your insight on the international law and the impact of this war. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.